Good morning. It's a pleasure to be here this morning as part of this this panel. I'm going to switch gears and talk about another component of a cropping system's carbon footprint, and that's nitrous oxide. Nitrous oxide certainly is the nitrogen side, but can be converted to a CO2 equivalent. And so this does factor into a grain crop's carbon intensity score. And just as a premise here, the work that I'll be sharing, one has been kind of a self-interest project, but then has really been taken on and gained some traction with the ethanol industry. And so we'll be looking at grain sorghum as an ethanol feedstock. And things advance. There we go. So when we think about it from an ethanol standpoint, we can look at how is that carbon intensity score calculated. And what we see here is that, we can look at the cradle to farm gate activities. Brian alluded to this in the intro, but we've got the energy inputs that go into the production of the farm inputs. This would be everything from, manufacturing of raw materials. It's the fuel, the electricity to produce that crop. We've got our other raw material inputs, fertilizer, pesticides. And so we've got these farming system inputs, then we've got fertilizer and agrochemicals, and then we've got feedstock production. And so these all come together, and the way that this is looked at is we've got what are considered direct emissions. These would be emissions during the production phase of the crop. And then we've got this pool of indirect emissions that would, the easiest way to think about it is they occur during the non-production period after the crop is harvested, before the next crop is planted. And then, we can see as we continue through this life cycle assessment, we have all the other inputs that come into play as that that grain leaves the farm gate and goes through the transformation into biofuels. So when we think about the farm and our opportunities there, and thinking really in terms of how do we manage the carbon intensity of a grain crop that we're producing, some of the key parameters that we can control, certainly yield is a major factor of this. The amount of ethanol that's produced per acre of land, factors into that conversion rate. And when we look at ethanol per bushel of corn or grain sorghum, we're about 2.88 gallons per bushel. So if we can increase our yields, we've got opportunities to lower our carbon intensity score. Fertilizer and chemical application rates certainly is a key area that factors in and is a controlling factor in this. And then in terms of other agronomic practices, nitrification inhibitors, again, what are our opportunities to reduce that fertilizer loss, increase the fertilizer use efficiency? What are conservation practices that we can bring into play that increase soil organic carbon? Thinking about the things that Katie talked about in the first session here, as well as, many of those present an opportunity to reduce on-farm energy use through tillage operations. And then we've got other things that can factor into this: manure applications, bringing organic carbon into the system, cover cropping, and reducing soil erosion. These all come together to factor into what is an overall carbon intensity score for a crop that's being produced. Diving a bit deeper into nitrous oxide. So how is nitrous oxide produced? Well, nitrate has the potential, when we've got the right set of conditions in the soil, to undergo denitrification. In a complete sense, we're going to see that process go all the way to dinitrogen gas. But many times that process is interrupted along the way, and we could see that be lost as nitric oxide gas, or frequently in what we measure is nitrous oxide gas. So some of the conditions that lead to nitrous oxide production include, waterlogged soils, anaerobic microsites within soil aggregates. pH is certainly a factor, but if we're managing our pH, that's not expected to be a major contributor. And then when we look at nitrous oxide as a greenhouse gas, it's got about a 300-time global warming potential of CO2. And when we look through the central and southern Great Plains, there really is a limited number of field studies to draw on to really understand what's happening. Just a little bit more here, as we look at sorghum as a bioenergy crop, and this is grain sorghum. We've got those similar ethanol yields to corn, but one of the real challenges for ethanol, and this was highlighted about 4 years ago when the California Air Resources Board looked at really putting sorghum at a discount to corn because of the lack of research on nitrous oxide emissions and data going into the life cycle assessment for grain sorghum. And so been involved in work over the last 3 years to address this research deficiency and really collect some unique data for the sorghum belt stretching from western Kansas down through Panhandle of Oklahoma and into Texas. But before we dive into western work, let's spend a few minutes looking at some work that we've done here on the eastern side of Kansas. So if you look at my title, Environment and Management and Conservation. When we think about environment, I think a lot about soil moisture in terms of nitrous oxide emissions. And then we can overlay conservation and nitrogen management on top of that. And so we had a long-term cover crop study that was started here in Manhattan in 2007. We wanted to determine how the legacy effects of legume and non-legume summer and winter cover crops between wheat and sorghum certainly impacted N availability to the cropping system. And then we wanted to look specifically at yield response of sorghum to N fertilization following the cover crops. And then I had the opportunity to overlay on top of this some nitrous oxide work to look at how the cover crop interacts with nitrous oxide emissions from the time that wheat is planted through the cover crop period. And we had a number of cover crops. We had double crop soybeans. We had a chem fallow wheat as our check. We had summer non-legume, which is a sorghum sedan, so our high biomass, high C to N ratio cover crop. Forage soybean is our summer legume cover crop. Winter non-legume was a daikon radish, and then our winter legume was crimson clover. And then following that was sorghum, and then the third year of the rotation was soybeans. Had a range of nitrogen application rates. We used a flat culture injector to get that nitrogen below the residue surface following sorghum planting. And so really trying to get that nitrogen placed where the growing crop was going to need it. And so to put this whole story together, we need to step back and look at what we were seeing in that cover crop phase. And so the first real interesting piece of this that we were able to document was that the cover crops, and this is the bottom panel here in this graph, significantly reduced the soil nitrate that was in the soil profile compared to our chemical fallow. So, you know, that highlights one of those advantages of cover crops, of utilizing residual nitrogen in the system, reducing its potential for loss through leaching. And with that, we also documented a decrease in the nitrous oxide emissions during that cover crop period. And most of that occurred in the late summer and early fall. So we've taken that nitrogen, we've stored it in the cover crop. We wanted to look and see, does that nitrogen have a potential to replace some of the fertilizer in the system? And so we calculated this nitrogen fertilizer replacement value. And the answer is yes, it does. What jumped out to us was that our summer legume cover crop had a replacement equivalent of about 30 pounds to the acre. Our double crop soybeans and our winter cover crops really were a push. They didn't hurt the system, they didn't benefit the system. And then our summer non-legume, that high biomass, high C/N ratio sorghum Sudan grass, actually had a nitrogen cost to the system, and that was calculated about 45 pounds of nitrogen per acre. And so what that means is when we look at the sorghum response over those N rates was that to maximize or reach our yield potential for the system where we had the summer non-legume cover crop, we needed to apply about 40 additional pounds of nitrogen. And that aligned right with what we had seen from that nitrogen fertilizer replacement value work. And so, you know, that sets us up with an interesting scenario. We've got a high biomass cover crop, so we've got some moisture conservation potential, but we're having to apply more nitrogen to that system to maximize yield. What does that mean from a nitrous oxide standpoint? And so this graph here looks at the winter wheat here, our cover crop phase, and then the following grain sorghum after that cover crop. In terms of the wheat phase, we really we didn't see a significant effect on the nitrous oxide emissions. Now, these N rates would be the legacy N rates from the previous sorghum crop, essentially 3 years prior. And so a blanket N rate was applied during the wheat production phase, and so we do not see a legacy effect on the nitrous oxide emissions during the winter wheat phase. But we do see that our cover crop treatments down here at the bottom, our double crop soybean, our sorghum Sudan, and our daikon radish are significantly reducing the nitrous oxide emissions compared to the chemical fallow. And so, you know, that again goes back and highlights that prior figure that I showed. And then during the sorghum production phase, we have a clear N rate effect, both in the individual years of 2015 and 16, as well as our across year analysis. So And that's been well established in the literature that as we increase our nitrogen rate, we're going to increase our nitrous oxide emissions. And then in terms of our cover crops, what we found was we actually had significantly higher nitrous oxide emissions from our double crop soybean and our sorghum Sudan grass cover crop. Daikon radish tended to, well, in some years was lower, sometimes it wasn't different, but chemical fallow had our lowest nitrous oxide emissions, and in this cross-year summary, it was significantly lower. Now, these numbers across the top are the average values of all three N rates. But if we remember that sorghum Sudan grass cover crop required that highest N rate, which is represented in the green bar to maximize yield, whereas if we look at our chem fallow or double crop soybeans and our daikon radish, nitrogen rate was maximized at the lower nitrogen rate in the system, the intermediary nitrogen rate in the system. And so, that represents a decrease in nitrous oxide emissions compared to the chemical fallow. And so, as we look at some of the implications out of this, certainly, cover crop selection and management have a potential to impact sorghum productivity. High legume cover crops have a potential to contribute nitrogen back to the system, but cover crops that have a high carbon to nitrogen ratio, such as the sorghum Sudan grass, require additional nitrogen inputs to the system to maximize that grain sorghum production. In terms of the cover crops, they do present a significant opportunity to reduce potential N losses, and that all needs to be balanced out as we find, how do we balance our production goals with our conservation goals. And then in terms of our nitrous oxide emissions factor, and just to reiterate what we're talking about here, so we've got N2O emissions. We think about it whether it's corn or grain sorghum production. We've got the direct nitrous oxide emissions derived from the inorganic fertilizer during the growing season. And then we've got this indirect N2O derived from the decomposition of the crop residue. Each of those is estimated in the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change documents at 1%, or a total of emission rate of 2%. During the direct emissions phase of the long-term cover crop study that I just presented, our direct emissions across all the treatments were estimated at about 0.9%, so pretty close to that 1% that's in the IPCC. But the question is, as we move west into the predominant sorghum production belt, what happens? Because we know moisture is a critical driver. And so Jason Warren and I, with others, have been leading this work for the last 3 years now. And really it's to quantify the nitrous oxide emissions from dryland grain sorghum cropping systems in the southern Great Plains, evaluate the effect of different nitrogen fertilizer rates, and come up with carbon intensity scores. And so we've got a line transect from Colby, Kansas at our northern end down through Goodwell, Oklahoma, with help from Summit. He actually was our postdoc in the first 2 years of the project. And so we've been looking at these different nitrogen fertilizer rates and sources. And I know I'm getting tight on time, so we'll advance here. and look at our cumulative emissions. So for Colby in 2018, our control, and there were no significant differences here, control was 0.3, 1.12 pounds of nitrogen per bushel based on the yield goal. Was 0.7. When we applied a best management practice in Colby, that was a urease inhibitor. In Goodwill, that was placement. We really didn't see, we had a slight decrease, but pretty similar to our baseline nitrogen rate. When we go through all of the calculations and work out the emissions factors, the emissions factor for Colby was 0.3%, Goodwill was 0.4%. So well below half of the default emissions factors, and these emission factors are calculated as both the direct and indirect emissions. So from sorghum planting all the way through sorghum harvest, or all the way through the fallow periods following sorghum until the next wheat crop was planted in this system. And so some takeaways we've seen, our greatest N2O fluxes have occurred within the first 14 days after fertilization. We're putting all of this nitrogen out at planting, and so, our period when plant uptake is minimal. During the fallow phase, our nitrous oxide fluxes have been negligible, and we've got another year of this project yet, and I think this will be some valuable data for our Southern Great Plains producers. And so with that, thank you for the opportunity to be a part of the panel this morning, Brian.
Thank you, Peter. Perfect timing. We have a couple minutes for any questions.